Okay, everybody, we're going to regroup now, go to our next session. Again, I'm very sorry for the shortened break. This session is a little shorter than scheduled, and so hopefully we're going to have a nice long lunch. So our next session is going to focus on the impact social policy and work with a particular focus on AI. This is a pretty hot topic these days, as you could maybe imagine. Go ahead and filter in while I'm talking, no problem. In fact, just an anecdote, in terms of like inviting speakers for this panel, the first three that we invited were unable to come, and then they turned out to just receive the Nobel Prize in economics. So I do hope we can invite them to the next institute or to give a talk at the Monk School sometime in the near future. But I am very thrilled with the panel, and Karen Myers is our moderator, who I'm going to introduce. She's the founder and CEO and president of Blueprint, a Toronto-based public policy consulting firm that uses innovation and evidence to address challenging public policy issues and design solutions to complex problems. So go ahead and let's give a warm welcome to Karen Myers and the panel. Thanks.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, everyone. So I am very conscious that we stand between you and lunch. So we are going to magically make our panel work on time. And we do have a little bit, because we have one fewer speaker, we have some things working in our favor. This panel is about the new world of work. And Stefano, I think, did an amazing job of laying out some of these mega trends and talking about their impact in how they relate to social protection. So what we're going to do in this panel is really dig into how they are impacting the world of work. So we're going to touch on technological advances, digitalization, demographic shifts, environmental challenges, how they're fundamentally reshaping our economy, and how businesses are responding with new models, approaches to producing goods and services, and some new ways of organizing work. And while these changes offer opportunities, they also bring some significant challenges that really demand our attention and raise some really important questions. And it's kind of interesting. It's like, it wasn't too long ago we were talking about, oh gosh, there's going to be massive layoffs, the jobs are going to disappear. And, we now know that the story is much more nuanced, and we're concerned much more with how we're going to upskill and reskill the working populations, how we're going to ensure that we have the highest labor force participation rate possible. And Stefano also talked about, when we think about older workers, we're going to need to be thinking about employability. And I would say that probably extends throughout the labor continuum. What I think we have less understanding about is what all of this means in terms of the dynamics of occupations and workplaces, how career trajectories, how economic mobility, inequality, how all of these things are playing out. And I mean, it was interesting that Andrew talked a little bit about that people aren't seeing work as the major source of their challenge, cited some optimism or lack of fear. And I think probably just don't know enough about what is happening and what may be happening. So I think, that's a place where we're going to dig into today. I'll also just call out a set of related questions, which is the question of whether we can change the future of our economy. And we've seen in the US just a massive, unprecedented investment in industrial policy, trillions of dollars directed towards infrastructure, clean energy, manufacturing. Ido made a case that we should be directing some of this towards the care economy. So, I think we need to really think about what role can we all play in this. And the flip side of demand side investments is that these investments would only fulfill their potential if there's a skilled workforce ready to meet those demands. So that's another piece of this puzzle, is what is the workforce development policy and programs that we need. And, you know, another thing Stefano talked about is some of the inequities in lifelong learning. Canada has good access, but lots of inequality within that access. So that's an area that I think we need to dig in and think about what we need to reform there. So we've got two fantastic panelists. They're each gonna, format is the same. They're each gonna speak for 15 minutes and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So we're gonna start with Nathan. Nathan Wilmers is an associate professor of work and organization studies at MIT Sloan School of Management. Nate is a leading scholar in market inequality and I think done some fantastic work, really looking at occupations, workplaces at a level of granularity that we don't always get to see. I'm intrigued by the title of your talk, After Inequality, Policy Lessons from Recent US Wage Growth. And so we'll have you go first. And then we'll have Dr. Arif Jehta. Arif is an associate scientific director at the Institute for Work and Health and an associate professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla School of Public Health. Arif is a leading scholar on the future of work and health impacts for vulnerable workers with a growing specialization in the impacts of AI. So I think that's going to fill in some of those questions that were raised in that first panel. So let's get started. Over to you.
So I'm only going to be talking about the U.S. today, but I think there's a couple of reasons why the U.S. is actually quite interesting, even if you don't live there. So one is that the U.S. has just been such a leader in the field of labor market inequality. We have sort of outpaced other countries, both in how early labor market inequality started growing, the very early 1980s, how quickly it grew and sort of how long it grew. You know, we learned this morning that basically Canada had leveled off by about 25 years ago. In the US, we sort of, you know, kept skyrocketing forward through the Great Recession. And you know, what this looked like was basically really rapid pay increases for, you could think of sort of managerial and professional type workers, relatively low wage growth for workers at the left-hand side there, food prep, sort of a lot of the care economy, personal services type jobs. And we actually saw real wage declines among what you could think of as sort of the sort of traditional blue collar middle skill jobs, drivers, warehouse, production, et cetera. So, you know, that's one reason why you might be interested in the US is we just like have so much labor market inequality and it increased so quickly. But another reason why you might be interested is in the last 7 years, there's been a really dramatic change in US labor markets, such that we basically undone about 1/3 of the total rise in inequality that we've seen since 1980 in just the course of a few years. What's this look like? Well, basically, for sort of the top 2/3 of the distribution here, you see pay increases basically leveling out. So roughly, you know, in a annualized basis, it's not that the sort of managers and professionals weren't doing that well. They were doing fine. Don't worry about Elon Musk, et cetera. They were doing okay. But for sort of occupations in the middle of the distribution, they went from real wage declines in the preceding 30 years to actually real wage increases in the last few years. The most dramatic change, though, is at sort of the far end of the chart where we have the lowest wage occupations in the economy. And here we just see really rapid pay increases that even outpace what's happening sort of at the top of the wage distribution over on the right-hand side. And so, you know, one concrete way to think about this is in the incidence of low-wage work, which the US sort of, you know, another thing that we've been a leader on relative to other OECD countries is like, we are the low-wage work capital of the world. You know, that was like a really distinctive thing about US labor markets. One way to measure that is thinking about the share of jobs that pay below or above $15 an hour. What you can see is like, basically that was pretty flat for 30 years. And then you just see that the share of jobs paying above $15 shooting up in the last 7 years. Now, this is even more dramatic if you just look at young workers. Basically, you know, circa 2015, 60% of employed people below the age of 30 were working in a job that was low wage, that paid below 15 bucks an hour. By 2022, basically, that number's been cut in half. So it goes from sort of the median labor market entry experience for American workers is low wage to something that looks quite different, something that basically we've gone to about 25% of those workers are low wage. So, really dramatic changes in the labor market that have also sort of led to some interesting knock-on effects. So one thing that these changes have driven is basically the first decline in race and ethnic inequality in the labor market that we've seen in about 40 years. So, through this whole period of increased equal opportunity enforcement, more corporate interest in diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera, we saw basically no progress in the white black or the white Latino wage gap in the US. If anything, we were sort of going in the wrong direction, that wage gap was growing a bit. But in the last 7 years, we've finally seen these numbers start to decline a bit. We've seen some meaningful compression in racial and ethnic wage inequality in the US. By and large, not because people have gotten less racist or something, but because these jobs, these low wage jobs that I've shown you have had really rapid wage increases. It's Black and Latino workers who are disproportionately concentrated in those jobs and therefore disproportionately gained from those pay increases, just like we saw with young workers as well. Another thing that we've seen that builds a bit on what we were talking about this morning is a decline in wealth inequality. So you might worry that wages are going up, but there's all these other things that are happening in the economy. You have these big asset price bubbles benefiting the top 1%. You have, inflation, increased housing costs, rising rent, et cetera. But we've actually seen during this period a smaller but still meaningful reversal in the dwindling share of total wealth that is held by the bottom 2/3 of Americans. You can see it sort of starts inching up. It sort of continues after COVID, consistent with the CTC and the other stuff that Chris was talking about. But this sort of bounce up actually starts prior to COVID as the recovery from the Great Recession really accelerated. Okay, so what can we learn from this, though? This sort of, I would say, snippet of kind of good news, even in the bad guy US context. So given that wages are rising pretty quickly in these lowest wage occupations, the first thing you might think of is the minimum wage. Well, it turns out the federal US minimum wage actually hasn't been increased since 2010. Basically, Obama raised it to $7.25 an hour. There's been no movement at all on the federal minimum wage since then. However, there's been a really active social movement of low-wage workers and unions, so-called Fight for 15, that's been pushing successfully for minimum wage increases both at the state and local municipal levels. So we can sort of divide up workers into workers who are covered by a state and local minimum wage or only covered by the federal minimum wage during this period. So think of these purple dots as Massachusetts, California, and New York. Think of the green triangles as Texas, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, the roughly 40% of American workers who have not experienced any minimum wage increase since 2010. What this chart is showing you is basically earnings changes across the earnings distribution. So again, you see sort of, there's some earnings increases in this basically top 50%, but you see really rapid earnings increases in the bottom half of the distribution. Now, it is the case that the purple triangles are higher than the blue triangle, than the green triangles at the bottom. Think of that as roughly speaking, a minimum wage effect. These state and local minimum wages were really successful at raising wages up at the very bottom, increasing earnings at the very bottom during this period. But if you look at the green triangles, if you look at the Alabamas and the Texases and the Georgias, you see there's still sort of this declining inequality shape of the distribution. You still see pretty rapid pay increases in roughly the 20th to the 40th percentiles of the distribution. So the story can't just be about minimum wages because we still see this big hump even for the non-minimum wage states and cities. Okay, so what else can it be? Well, clearly it has something to do with low unemployment, tight labor markets, et cetera, the kind of stuff that we were talking about this morning. Here, a key question is how much of this is sort of cyclical and connected to macroeconomic policies having sort of a big aggressive response to the COVID recession versus how much is basically secular and about shifting labor supply, baby boomers retiring, lower net migration until 2021, 2022, aging workforce, et cetera, et cetera. Those are sort of deep and important labor economics-y questions that I'm going to set to sort of one side for the rest of the talk. And the reason for that is if you decompose declining inequality into sort of a component that you could think of as roughly the worker stuff. So supply and demand for skill, all these compositional changes in the workforce, think of that as the blue line. The worker stuff was a big driver of rising inequality, and it's also really important for the falling inequality that we've seen since the recovery from the Great Recession, particularly important in the last couple of years post-COVID. But there's another piece here that's also important and that I think is somewhat under-recognized, and that's why I want to kind of focus on it for today. And that's the red line. Think of the red line as basically inequality not due to differences in worker characteristics, due to differences in sort of whether somebody has a college degree or a high school degree, or they studied computer programming versus philosophy like I studied. Those sort of wage gaps, that's all lumped into the blue line. Think of the red line as basically inequality due to where you work, whether you happen to have gotten a job at a high-paying firm or a relatively low-paying firm. What you can see is that was sort of bouncing up a little bit in the rising inequality period. But since the recovery from the Great Recession, basically there's been a big compression between different firms and how much inequality these companies are generating. So what I want to argue in the last few minutes of this talk is that this actually is an opportunity for social policymakers to think a bit more about employers and workplaces and firms as crucial sites for intervention in sort of affecting inequality, poverty, mobility. So let me give one example. So, I mentioned the US is kind of a bad guy with respect to its international reputation and low wage work inequality, et cetera. Well, the baddest of the bad guys is Walmart, right? Like if we think about sort of, a company that was really pioneering this low wage employment model, the first thing you're going to think of is Walmart. And indeed, in 2014, that is absolutely the case. You can see Walmart, this is the distribution of, all relatively low paid retail cashier type jobs. But even in that low wage occupation distribution, you still see Walmart as a pretty low wage employer, kind of holding up this big left part of the distribution right up against that federal minimum wage level. Fast forward though to 2012, you can see this whole distribution has shifted down to the right. There's a big spike in the distribution. That's $15 an hour. So again, think of that fight for 15 having a real impact on, there's a bunch of companies that start paying 15 bucks an hour exactly. But you can also see the red dashed line is Walmart in 2022. They've shifted from being a below median, basically holding up the left tail of the retail labor market, to actually being an above median employer by 2022. So retail wages are going up throughout the economy, but Walmart's wages are actually outpacing that overall change in pay, quite surprisingly. And part of what's driving this is that Walmart in 2015 announced that they weren't going to pay the sort of statutory minimum wage anymore. They're going to adopt a corporate minimum wage. They're going to pay at least $9 an hour. A year later, they raised it to 10. Now it's up to 17 in some places. And Walmart was one of like a bunch of companies that started doing this. Amazon prominently adopted a $15 an hour minimum. And what you can see is that basically if you follow workers over time, if they're working at a company that adopts one of these minimums, their pay actually does go up quite meaningfully by about 5%, even relative to other similar workers in the same labor markets and same industries not affected by these policies. Even more important though, the companies that adopt these minimums sometime during this period basically eliminate the racial wage gap that they previously held within their company, within their workplaces. The black-white wage gap among hourly workers essentially disappears as these companies start to adopt these policies. And particularly interesting from a social policy standpoint, we also see that employers that adopt these minimums were like, really high poverty employers. So this is the official poverty rate that Chris was just complaining about. We've done this like six different ways. The one on the left is basically a relative poverty measure. But even looking at the official poverty rate, about 15% of workers at Walmart plus Amazon plus Target plus these big low-wage employers, 15% of them were working in working poverty. You can see that over time, as these policies get adopted, basically working poverty rates in these companies converge to rates that we see elsewhere in the economy. So it's not that this is sort of totally solving the working poverty problem, but it's really making a pretty huge difference in these workers' lives. Okay, so let's tell companies to raise wages. Okay, like maybe not a super compelling kind of creative social policy thing to say. So I want to finish up by just looking a little more deeply in exactly how companies raised wages during this period. How'd they pay for this stuff? Well, Walmart, at the same time as they adopted these new minimum wages, they also basically tried to reorganize the work that was done in their superstores and grocery at checkout, et cetera. And they said, look, we're going to change the way we do things. We're going to adopt sort of a team-based model where instead of just scheduling individual workers at whatever time, we're going to schedule workers together repeatedly so that they can build some sort of camaraderie, some collaboration, rather than just like working with a stranger every time you're assigned. They also started a bunch of cross-training so that if you're a Walmart cashier, we want you to know how to do shelf stocking, how to do inventory quality stuff, so that if somebody on your team is out sick or something, you can step in and help. They also kind of tried to introduce some more career ladder within the store so that it's not just like, okay, you get the sort of, you win the lottery and become a store manager, which is like a 1 in 100 shot if you compare the number of store managers at Walmart to the number of frontline associates. They sort of added these intermediary positions. They added some extra pay for working in certain departments in the store, kind of trying to make this job a more appealing and hopefully also more productive thing. Now, a bunch of companies, as they were dealing with tight labor markets, did different versions of this, some of which we could think of as maybe a more kind of high road, trying to increase the value add from workers, some of which looks more like technological adoption and kind of labor substitution as labor is getting more expensive in these jobs. So, Petco is a great example of just sort of like pure sort of work intensification where they say, look, we're rolling out kind of all this e-commerce stuff. We're going to have pickup and same day delivery. Basically, we're not going to hire anybody new to do these jobs. We're just going to use people that previously were sort of standing around the store, not taking a break or taking a moment to themselves. And so as a result of these kinds of changes, what we've seen at the same time as we've seen this big reduction in labor market inequality in the US, these big pay increases at the bottom of the pay distribution, is we've actually seen like a productivity boom in low-wage industries where, the blue line here shows high-wage industries. You could think of this as basically professional services, think of this as software engineering, all this stuff. You can see that you had really rapid productivity increases in those high-wage industries at the same time as you also had rapid pay increases in those industries. But in the last few years, there's really been a switch where basically it's low-wage employers that have seen sort of a productivity boom consistent with the examples that I just showed you, rather than high-wage employers and middle-wage employers, which ends up being a lot of manufacturing, construction, et cetera. They've actually had stagnant productivity for the last 10 or 15 years, which is its own kind of puzzle. But I think the sort of low-wage productivity boom here is one kind of reason for optimism. Okay, so what? Basically, the main thing I want to leave you with is that firms really play an important role here. They're not just kind of conduits of overall labor market trends. They're making decisions about their pay scales, about how they're organizing work, how they're adopting technology. And now I remembered after the introduction that Dan had asked me to say something about AI. And part of the reason why this wasn't a big part of the talk is I'm actually quite optimistic about AI in that I think we're seeing sort of some big labor market changes here, a lot of which have something to do with technology, but they don't have anything to do with ChatGPT. Again, they're like using, waitstaff using tablets and e-commerce and this kind of like less sexy stuff. But a lot of the early research we have on the relative skill bias of artificial intelligence is that it's going to be likely more labor replacing for white collar managerial, et cetera, type workers, less labor replacing for the kinds of low wage jobs that I'm talking about. But huge confidence intervals around that. Of course, this is an emerging thing that we know very little about. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. And so I'm here to provide a bit of a different perspective. And so my talk's going to focus a little bit more on the future of work. And I'm going to bring in some of the themes that Nathan had touched on and maybe also focus on the lived experience. Like, what does it look like for a worker who's now encountering changes in the future of work? So just a quick plug to my organization, the Institute for Work and Health. We've been around for 30 years. We're kind of small, but we lead research in the area of work and health. And that's really the frame of reference that I take. We're interested in understanding how the work environment changes and how that shapes the health and well-being of different working groups. And so as I'm speaking, just kind of be conscious of that perspective. Okay, so one thing that we continue to see when we study the topic of the future of work, which is a evolving area, it's constantly changing, it's dynamic, and is made up of social, technological, environmental, and political factors, is that there's going to be unequal distribution of benefits as well as disadvantages that emerge from different trends. In 2021, my team at the Institute for Work and Health, we led a horizon scan, which aimed to identify the different trends that would make up the future of work. And we identified 9 key trends, some of which were related to AI and the digital transformation of the economy. And what we found when synthesizing all of this literature is that for some, the future of work will create new economic opportunities and raise productivity. And that's really great. But for others, the future of work is going to diminish economic opportunities and erode the quality of work. When we kind of dived into like what's being published on this topic, what are people writing about, what we found was that groups that have been systemically marginalized in the past, they run the risk of entering the future of work at a position of disadvantage. And that's pretty critical. So why is this important from a Canadian perspective? Well, the Canadian labor market is characterized by a high level of inequity. A worker's identity, their social position can shape their access to work. So employment opportunities, work arrangements, so whether they're in precarious work or better quality, high quality work, as well as their working conditions. So their day-to-day like psychosocial, physical work environment that they're exposed to. And data also show that there's a substantial subset of Canadian workers who may be adversely then affected by changes in the future of work. I know I'm speaking on this panel with economists. So I thought to get some like street cred, I should probably put some like graphs on the board first. So I'm just going to do this and bear with me. And I'm just going to breeze through this quickly. It's just to prove that I can look at data as well. So when we look at like Canada's labor force survey, which kind of like does a nice snapshot of what's going on in the Canadian labor market, we consistently see different inequities. So a good example is the gender pay gap, which although it has diminished over time, it still exists and it's quite prominent. And what we know is that this gender pay gap is exacerbated for like certain groups like Indigenous women or immigrant women workers. Another example that we see is amongst recent immigrants who have high rates of employment that are almost 2 times that of non-immigrant workers or immigrants who've been in Canada for a longer period of time. Other examples of inequities in the Canadian labor market include differences in median hourly wages when comparing workers with low educational attainment to those with the highest levels of educational attainment. And I think what's really important to highlight is that this difference has grown substantially over the last 2 decades. And then kind of in keeping with the theme, I just want to highlight that we're doing a lot of research on the impact of AI on the labor market, and we're utilizing a lot of economics exposure estimates. And what we've found is there's a wide degree of inequity that exists, or a wide range of stratification that exists with regards to the impact of AI on the labor market. And in a recent study that we published using Canada's labor force survey, what we found was that women workers are characterized or more likely to be in jobs characterized by a high exposure to machine learning when compared to men. Now, I do want to highlight that this doesn't mean it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that women are working in jobs that machine learning is going to be kind of more prominent, and that could actually have productivity benefits and improve their working lives. But we saw this across a number of different working groups, and I'm happy to share this research with you guys a little bit more. So we've moved past like the hardcore like data, so I don't need to like play like I know what I'm talking about. But I wanted to really like situate ourselves in the lived experience. Like, what does it look like to be a worker in this economy that is constantly changing? So I thought I would spotlight one specific group of workers that I've done a bunch of research on, and that is persons with disabilities. They encounter the labor market quite differently than like the typical Canadian worker. And I think it's important to highlight how they might be affected by changes in the future of work. So currently, I'm not sure if people are familiar with this, but a large number of Canadians are living with a disability. Over a quarter of us have a disability in some way, shape, or form. And this is like persons with disabilities are amongst the most economically disadvantaged groups, and that has not changed over time. It continues to exist, and it exists in different ways. Persons with disabilities are less likely to be employed. In a study that we led at our institution, we found that persons with disabilities are more likely to be employed in precarious jobs and are less likely to be in jobs that are secure and provide growth opportunities. So the ones that we all kind of strive towards, the ones that give us like the most kind of fulfilling working lives and provide us with training opportunities and just growth opportunities in general. And so kind of based on this data, we can probably hypothesize that persons with disabilities are going to be adversely affected by changes in the future of work. And so that's what we sought to understand a little bit more. We went out and talked to folks in the field. We wanted to talk to persons with disabilities, policy leaders, future of work specialists, people who are working in employment service provisions, and ask them like, what are your thoughts? Like, how do things look for you as you move forward in this working world where things are drastically changing, where you're being exposed to technology on a regular basis? And kind of in keeping with the theme of like labor market inequity, what we heard was that in particular to the digital transformation of the economy, there's going to be inequity in the way people experience that. And when we talked to participants, we kind of heard two things. The first was that new digital technologies like AI, Internet of Things devices, 5G technology, it's going to could have some benefits. It could advance employment inclusion and create new jobs, create new ways to be more productive at work, maybe even be utilized to adapt to a person's disability. But at the same time, many people also said that, you know, technology is going to erode my working life. It's going to make things harder. It's going to make things more precarious. I'm really scared. And whether a person was facing advantage or disadvantage kind of related to two key themes. The first was their existing employment arrangements. So whether they were working precariously to begin with, or whether they had a secure and rewarding job. The second factor that determined advantage or disadvantage was related to whether they were caught within the digital divide. And I'll just kind of briefly highlight on those two themes in the next few slides. So again, what we consistently heard was that participants with disabilities who were working securely, they welcomed the introduction of new technologies. They were excited by AI. They were excited by digital transformations that were occurring within their working life. Meanwhile, those who were working precariously consistently noted that technological adoption was going to negatively impact us and their ability to access employment in the future. So one participant said, "I don't think technology is going to be a good thing in my job. Customers now interface with a computer screen and tells them everything they need to know. What use are us to be there?" And that was a very consistent theme that emerged in a lot of our interviews amongst precarious workers. So other participants talked about being caught in the digital divide. And when we kind of explored this concept a bit more in our interviews, what we heard was that the digital divide was kind of related to three key themes. The first was disparities in having access to different digital technologies. So whether or not you have like really good internet at home, whether or not you have access to a computer at home, whether or not you can use like you have a cell phone. Many persons with disabilities reported kind of not having those types of resources, and that created a disadvantage. The second was resources, so income, being in a community where you might not have stable internet or where you might not have access to a library where there is like computers that you can utilize. And the third was a skills divide, so disparities in possessing critical digital skills and inequities in digital training opportunities. So we talk a lot about upskilling and reskilling the labor market, and many persons with disabilities felt that they were excluded from those types of opportunities, and that kind of added to this digital divide that they were facing. So one participant highlighted the lack of disability considerations in a workplace adopting new technologies, and this was especially disadvantageous for those precariously employed. They said, I think that technology can only do so much. if those technological advances are not paired with structural and institutional attitudes of accessibility. When I look at technological advances, they seem to prioritize an ethic of productivity. We live precarious lives, and we don't know what our future will look like in terms of our income and our access to social benefits. Another kind of policy participant brought this idea of the digital divide to life quite well, and highlighted the role poverty can play amongst this group and how that can mean they're excluded from the digital transformation of the economy. They noted it costs money to be employed, which sounds kind of silly, but it costs money for a computer, it costs money for Wi-Fi, for an internet connection, it costs money to access all those resources that you need. Okay, so this has been like a really brief, like a synthesis of like one specific group encountering the digital transformation of the economy. But the kind of key theme of this was like, how do we support pathways to inclusive employment in a changing labor market? And so we sought to like address this question through another study that we recently completed. And in keeping with our spotlight on persons with disabilities, we sought to examine the specific strategies that could be taken to promote employment inclusion in the future of work. And when we asked folks about what would it take to keep people employed with regards to the digital transformation of the economy, they talked about two things. The first was ongoing disability inclusive upskilling and reskilling opportunities. And the second is policy supports that ensure access to essential digital resources, like regulating the price of digital resources, subsidizing access to digital resources, or investing in digital infrastructure within communities. One employment service provider highlighted the importance of skills training that would both meet the needs of a changing labor market and were accessible. They noted, I think it's vitally important that skills training needs are met and we articulate what the future of work looks like. And not only that skills training needs are met, but they're accessible for people with disabilities. And very lastly, I think when we talk about themes like the digital transformation of the economy, the future of work, we need to highlight these are ongoing changes. They will continue to emerge. The impact of AI on the labor market is only going to evolve over time. And so many participants talked about that, creating skills building that would evolve. One participant highlighted this nicely. People will talk about closing the talent gap or closing the skills gap. And the truth of the matter is we never do close that gap. Let's say we close it today, we can celebrate, hey, we closed that skills gap, but tomorrow it's opened because technology changes. So just to conclude, I think it's important to highlight, and I think we all kind of agree that the labor market is inequitable and changes in the future of work have the potential to exacerbate that inequity. And so there's a need to understand and study the potential challenges and opportunities in the future of work for different groups of workers. And obviously we've talked about persons with disabilities here, but I'm sure we could conduct similar types of studies amongst workers of color, immigrant workers, and there'd be new themes, new policy supports. And I think we need to kind of understand that there's not like one homogeneous like policy solution, and we need to think about how different groups interact with these different changes. So with that, here's my contact information if you want to learn more about any of this research, and I'm happy to participate in this panel now.
Thank you, Arif, for that. Thank you for disaggregating data and doing so in a way that brings in perspectives of people with lived experience, right? This is the first time we have done this this morning. So I think that's a really, really important, and giving that sense of how people might experience some of these changes differently, and identifying what some of those factors are. I'm particularly interested in the notion of work arrangements and the precarity of work. So that's a really important factor to highlight. So we are close to our lunch break. Do we want to take 10 minutes? Okay, so I would propose that we take 3 questions and we take those questions all at once and then turn it over to the 2 of you to just address elements that make most sense given your perspectives. All right, so let's go with Catherine and the gentleman in the front here, and then we'll take one from the other side here.
Thanks. What I'm wondering about in terms of persons with disabilities and your last slide with that quote that talked about, there's not a one-time that we're going to solve the skills gap. So at ESDC, we call it lifelong learning, and the necessity now for generations from now on to have lifelong learning as an approach. I'd be interested to know if some of your conversations and the work you did with persons with disability and their labor market participation, that aspect of lifelong learning from the lens of disability inclusion and the kinds of differences it might mean for their participation in the labor market, as well as the responsibility that employers have, both in closing the gap in the employment and labor force participation of persons with disabilities, as well as skills and training, because Canada, as Stefano knows, is not a leader in the space of employers working on and contributing to skills and training of employees.
Okay, all right. So we've got one question related to understanding how we promote inclusion for people with disability, and particularly what our focus is on lifelong learning and the role of employers in that. Let's take another question.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Nathan. My question is for you. You showed a number of different charts about both inequality and wages and productivity that had a trend between roughly 2016 and 2022. Now, I'd like you to comment whether it's correlation or causation, that this is also the period that there was a pronounced decline in the number of undocumented workers in the United States, as documented by the Brookings Institute and Pew, with the loss of 1.5 to 4 million undocumented workers affect the supply and therefore affect the outcomes for low-wage workers who remain. Thank you.
Okay, so a very important question on the impact of undocumented workers on labor supply and what that means in terms of earnings outcomes. So we've got one more question over there.
My name is Lisa Kaida. I'm an associate professor of sociology at McMaster University. And my question is to Nathan. As someone who read your 2021 American Sociological Review article, my question is, how does your argument of consolidated advantage of the increased concentration of high-skilled occupations / highly paid firms fit with your presentation on declining wage inequality? Thank you.
Okay. And I would like to piggyback on that using some moderator privilege. Is this scalable? I mean, we used to talk about high road employment, and we just had a couple of those case studies like Trader Joe and so on. Now there we see many firms are. Is this something that can scale to the whole economy? Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can take my question first, and then Nathan, you can take over. So the question was about lifelong learning, and in the discourse on the future of work, lifelong learning is kind of a critical aspect of this. What we know is that things are changing so rapidly that, you know, one point in time of upskilling and reskilling is not going to be sufficient. And I think we're all seeing this as new technologies roll out. We're all keeping up. And many of us in the room have the privilege of hopefully being in a secure job, having the opportunity to learn, having the opportunity to like have colleagues who are teaching us as well, or people around us. But many people don't. And it's not just persons with disabilities. Many folks in Canada are kind of situated within like a system of disadvantage where they might not have resources, support, time, income that allow them to upskill and reskill. So I think a big challenge for policy leaders, educational programmers, is to make their skilling initiatives more inclusive for a broader range of Canadians. And I think it's a challenging task because I think we're just like, we're keeping up. We're not keeping up with the pace of change. And that's already one big issue. And then we're trying to keep up with being as inclusive as possible and addressing a lot of these systemic barriers that people are facing. And I think it's just a challenging task, but I think it's one that we need to like confront so that we can make sure that our labor market is prepared for these many changes that will occur. And just with regards to employer like provided skilling programs, I think it's a critical part of the storyline, and employers aren't stepping up. And I think about a lot of employers that I've been exposed to who are good employers, and they're not keeping up, right? And so I think it's a bigger conversation. And I think what's going to end up happening is 10 years down the line, a lot of employers are going to look at their like workforce and be like, wow, we're really behind. And it's going to be like a cyclical pattern of catching up to something that's like a kind of a runaway train situation. And so hopefully folks like yourself at ESDC, you can kind of lead that policy charge and encourage encourage employers to kind of take on that challenge and also show them the benefits of it. Because I think there are a number of really good case examples of employers. Like, for example, I know like AT&T, a while back, they decided to upskill a lot of their workers to kind of adapt to this AI revolution. And as a result, their kind of workforce is better situated than other telecom companies in the US. I think there's a lot of good case examples that kind of bring that to light.
Great. So first on immigration. So I mentioned immigration briefly as one of a few labor supply things. As you probably know, effect of immigration on native wages is like one of the most contested, topics in labor market inequality research. So I would say there's basically 4 big labor supply changes, and it's a little hard to know which are the most important, though we're working on this. One is decline in immigration from low-skilled countries, particularly from Mexico. The second is baby boomers starting to retire. Baby boomers disproportionately non-college, and the set of non-college baby boomers are retiring early. Third thing is some increase in the rate of college attainment among younger Americans following the Great Recession. Fourth thing is a sort of surprising no recovery in teen employment in the US. After the Great Recession, it falls off a cliff, never recovers. All 4 of those things are reducing labor supply, arguably reducing labor supply, particularly at the bottom where we see these big changes. We're working right now on a project trying to quantify basically which of these are more and less important. I think the reasons to think immigration is important are sort of obvious. One reason I think it might not be as important as you're expecting is we sort of had an experiment of a big reversal in this over the last couple of years in the US, where we had a big influx of Central American, but particularly Venezuelan asylum seekers. Starting 2021 to 2022 especially was the spike. Now it's a little different from undocumented migration from Mexico. They're actually legally allowed to work while their asylum case is pending. But we don't see sort of a pause even in this declining inequality trend that I was showing you before as those asylum seekers start coming in. But the true answer to this is, I don't know. It's very plausible to me. This is a big thing that was changing along with other labor supply stuff. Second question. Thank you so much for reading that article. I really appreciate it. And unfortunately, so basically that article is about if you're working in a high wage occupation, you're also employed in a high paying firm. So it used to be that maybe you're a blue collar worker working at Ford or GM or something. You're in a low paid occupation, but you're working at a pretty generous firm. Basically now high paying firms are finance, tech, highly skill homogenous firms that are basically only employing workers who are already advantaged in virtue of their occupation and their skills. We have seen no reversal in the rate at which workers in high skilled occupations are disproportionately at high paying firms. What we have seen is a bit of a reshuffling between the bottom and the middle, such that there's fewer sort of middle skill occupations in high paying firms, more low skill occupations in high paying firms. So insofar as we've seen any change since that 2021 paper, it's really sort of reallocating the middle and the bottom rather than affecting anything happening at the top. Last and hardest one is the scalable. So one thing I'd say is, a lot of this research on high involvement or high performance work systems always felt to me like kind of advocates and academics screaming into the void. So for years we were saying like, look, there's these sort of really productive ways to do things, and then being surprised that employers weren't taking us up on it, right? And I think what the change that we've seen in the last few years, and again, I want to emphasize this isn't all high road stuff. Some of this is just sort of labor replacing technology, arguably making the experience of work more intense, more stressful, et cetera. But insofar as we've seen, again, these surprising cases like Walmart adopting some of this stuff, I think it is only in the context of tight labor markets that you see this. It's not that employers have had some like magical change of heart relative to when. Exactly. It's basically the low road option has become increasingly foreclosed to a lot of employers. And so what's that mean for predicting the future? Well, I do think a lot of organizational change is quite sticky. And once you make these shifts, you can indeed end up on sort of a different trajectory where you're not going to then sort of reorganize the store, eliminate team-based work as soon as the next recession hits. On the other hand, I think it's sort of too early to know how much of this is basically cyclical, because in the US, more or less, surprisingly, we still haven't really had a recession of the type that we had 10 years ago. And so I think it's a bit too early to say, but I think that the big thing that I've updated on in the last few years is how much having a tight labor market is to some extent a precondition to these other sort of employer-driven and more institutional changes. There's a lot of complementarities there.
Yeah, that tracks. That's what Kelly, you said this morning earlier. Okay, well, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. I think this could have gone on for much, much longer. So give a hand to our panelists.
Just want to thank Karen for moderating and the speakers for moderating a wonderful session, very rich. So it's lunchtime, hooray. I know you guys must be starving. Feel free to head out, get some food. The weather doesn't look super sunny, but if it's not raining, you can feel free to eat in the courtyard, spread out. You can come back in here. I hope you get a chance to check out some of the posters. We will regroup at 1:45 for our next session. So enjoy your lunch and look forward to seeing you back in 1:45.